Most people remember Winston Churchill as a voice that refused to break while the world was breaking around it, a voice that spoke of courage when cities burned and of endurance when defeat felt inevitable. But history has a habit of editing its heroes. It smooths the rough edges. It removes the long silences. It forgets the years when no one was listening. Before Churchill became the man history needed, he was a man history repeatedly rejected. There was a time when his name carried embarrassment rather than authority, a time when his opinions were dismissed as dangerous, when his career appeared finished not because he lacked ambition, but because he had too much of it. And that is where this story truly begins, not with victory, but with isolation. Because the most dangerous thing about Winston Churchill was not his confidence or his stubbornness or even his ego. It was his refusal to disappear. Tonight we're going to step away from the speeches and the statues and move into the quieter rooms of his life, into the years that shaped him before history ever called his name. We're going to explore how failure formed his instincts, how loneliness sharpened his resolve, and how a man almost written out of history became impossible to ignore. So before you get comfortable, please like the video and subscribe for more amazing documentaries. I promise you won't regret it. And also tell me your location and your local time in the comments. It's always satisfying to see from where you're joining us from. This is not the story of a savior. It is the story of someone who survived long enough to be useful. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born into privilege, but not comfort. His family belonged to Britain's highest social circles, yet emotional closeness was rare. His parents were distant figures, physically present in his life only when schedules allowed, and emotionally present even less often. As a child, Churchill learned something early and painfully. Affection was conditional. This absence left marks. He grew up desperate to be noticed, yet constantly reminded that he fell short. Teachers found him unfocused. His academic performance was inconsistent. Discipline came easier to others than it did to him. In an environment where lineage mattered, young Winston carried a famous name but lacked the discipline expected to honor it. Failure became familiar, and with it came humiliation. But something unusual happened in those early years. Instead of retreating inward, Churchill began to harden. Each disappointment didn't extinguish his ambition, it refined it. He developed a deep belief that recognition was not given, it was taken. This belief would follow him for the rest of his life. Churchill did not drift into danger accidentally. He sought it deliberately. Military postings in unstable regions became opportunities to prove himself. He chased conflict, not only to serve, but to be seen. Risk became his method of self-definition. Where others hesitated, Churchill advanced, not always wisely, but always loudly. War gave him what classrooms could not: clarity. In chaos, he found purpose. In uncertainty, he found direction. Yet even here, success was inconsistent. Triumph and failure followed each other closely, often separated by little more than chance. Still, Churchill learned something vital during these years: how fragile reputation truly is. He also discovered the one weapon that never abandoned him: words. Writing allowed Churchill to control narrative when reality slipped from his grasp. Through articles, books, and speeches, he learned how to frame events, how to command attention, how to turn experience into authority. Language became more than communication, it became survival. But ambition without restraint is rarely admired. As Churchill climbed the political ladder, he made enemies just as quickly as he made progress. He spoke too much, listened too little, and refused to soften his views to preserve alliances. To some, he was courageous. To others, intolerable. And then came Gallipoli, the campaign that would define his failure. It was meant to be decisive. Instead, it was catastrophic. Lives were lost. Responsibility was unavoidable. Churchill became the symbol of miscalculation at the worst possible moment. His fall was swift, stripped of power, pushed aside, quietly blamed. For many politicians, this would have been the end. For Churchill, it became a long pause. Years passed where he held no real influence. Parliament moved forward without him. His warnings were dismissed. His presence tolerated, not respected. History seemed ready to forget him. But Churchill was watching. He observed the world shifting. He studied patterns others ignored. He spoke when silence felt safer, and warned when optimism felt easier. Few listened, fewer believed him, and yet something was forming beneath the surface. Not certainty, but readiness, because while others prepared for peace, Churchill prepared for collapse. And when collapse finally arrived, Britain would remember the man it had tried so hard to forget. But that moment was still ahead. For now, Winston Churchill remained a figure in waiting, misunderstood, isolated, and quietly preparing for the role no one wanted him to play. Not yet a leader, just a man who refused to stop speaking into the dark. The most dangerous years of Winston Churchill's life were not spent under bombs. They were spent being ignored. After Gallipoli, there was no dramatic exile, no official condemnation carved into stone. There was something far worse: polite dismissal. Churchill was not banished from public life. He was allowed to remain just close enough to watch relevance drift away. These were the years when history passed him by in silence. In Parliament, his speeches landed without echo. His warnings were met with sighs, not applause. Younger men rose. New voices filled the chamber. Churchill, once impatient for attention, now found himself speaking to rooms already thinking about something else. For a man whose identity had been forged in recognition, this was not just political decline, it was existential. He tried to adapt. He wrote more. He painted landscapes, quiet scenes, controlled worlds where chaos obeyed the brush. He surrounded himself with routine, with habits that imposed order where influence no longer existed. But beneath the surface, something restless remained. Churchill was waiting for history to catch up with him, and history, at first, refused. Europe in the 1920 seconds and early 1930 seconds wanted recovery, not warnings. After the devastation of the First World War, the appetite for fear had evaporated. Nations wanted reassurance. They wanted treaties. They wanted to believe that catastrophe had been exhausted. Churchill offered none of that. He spoke of rearmament when others spoke of reconciliation. He spoke of rising threats when leaders spoke of economic stability. To many, he sounded outdated, trapped in the instincts of an older war, unable to accept a new world. His critics did not see a prophet. They saw a relic. Even his temperament worked against him. Churchill was blunt, where diplomacy required softness. He interrupted, he provoked, he overstated. In an era that prized calm negotiation, he brought urgency, and urgency made people uncomfortable, so they dismissed it. This dismissal hardened him. Churchill did not retreat into silence. Instead, he refined his arguments. He gathered information obsessively, reading reports others skimmed, tracking military developments with an intensity that bordered on fixation. He noticed patterns forming where others saw isolated events. Germany was changing, not suddenly but steadily. While much of Britain viewed developments on the continent as distant and manageable, Churchill saw something else entirely. He saw momentum. He saw ideology replacing caution. He saw a nation reorganizing itself around grievance and expansion, and he spoke about it again and again and again. Each warning landed with diminishing returns. There is a particular loneliness in being correct too early. It isolates you not because you are wrong, but because the consequences of being right are too heavy to accept. Churchill lived inside that loneliness for years. He was called alarmist, warmonger, obsessive. Some accused him of craving conflict simply to regain relevance. Others suggested his judgment had been permanently damaged by past failures. Churchill listened to all of it and kept going. He understood something most politicians avoided, that popularity is not the same as accuracy. He had learned, painfully, that consensus often forms around comfort, not truth. And he was willing, perhaps uniquely willing, to remain unpopular if it meant remaining prepared. Still, preparation without power is only anticipation. By the late 1930 seconds, Europe stood at the edge of something unmistakable. Agreements were signed, promises were made, hope was performed publicly, even as private doubt grew. Churchill watched these moments closely. Each compromise felt to him like another step toward inevitability. Each concession felt like time borrowed at interest. When war finally arrived, it did not surprise him, but it did vindicate him. The transition was abrupt. One day he was an irritant, the next, a necessity. Britain did not turn to Churchill because it admired him. It turned to him because alternatives had collapsed. Leadership arrived not as a reward, but as a last resort. Churchill understood this immediately. He did not celebrate. He did not soften. He did not pretend unity where none existed. He stepped into authority with the full awareness that he had been chosen not for charm but for resolve. And resolve was something he had been practicing in private for years. The early days of his leadership were not triumphant. They were bleak. Military realities were grim. Retreats outnumbered victories. Confidence was fragile. Fear was widespread. Churchill did not attempt to erase this fear. Instead, he acknowledged it. His speeches did not promise safety. They promised endurance. They did not describe victory as inevitable, but survival as possible. In doing so, he achieved something rare: credibility. People believed him because he did not lie to them. Behind the scenes, however, the strain was immense. Churchill worked relentlessly, often sleeping little, moving from briefing to briefing, absorbing responsibility without deflection. Decisions carried weight not measured in popularity, but in lives. And still, doubt followed him. He questioned his own instincts. He revisited old failures. He felt the familiar pressure of history's gaze. But unlike earlier years, he no longer chased approval. He focused on function. This shift mattered. Churchill had learned, slowly and painfully, that leadership was not about being admired. It was about being useful at the right moment. His years of obscurity had stripped him of illusions. What remained was clarity. That clarity shaped everything that followed. Yet even as his public image solidified into something mythic, the private cost accumulated. Exhaustion became constant. Anxiety lingered beneath confidence. The loneliness never fully disappeared, it simply changed shape. Churchill was no longer ignored, but he was still alone at the top. These years between rejection and necessity formed the spine of his legacy. They taught him patience without softness, urgency without panic, and conviction without consensus. Without them, he would not have survived what came next, because the war would test not only his leadership but his endurance. And endurance, more than brilliance, would define what remained long after. Power does not arrive with clarity. It arrives with noise, interruption, and impossible choices. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, Britain was not waiting to be inspired. It was waiting to survive. The illusion of control had already collapsed. Europe was burning. Armies were retreating. Maps were being redrawn faster than promises could be kept. This was not a moment built for optimism, and Churchill knew it. He stepped into leadership without the luxury of preparation time. There was no gentle transition, no period of adjustment. From the first day, decisions carried irreversible weight. Every delay meant loss. Every error multiplied. For the first time in his life, Churchill was not speaking from the margins. He was responsible. The early weeks were defined by compression. Events moved faster than strategy. Reports contradicted each other. Intelligence was incomplete. The future refused to reveal its shape. Churchill was forced to act, not with certainty, but with probability. And probability is a cruel foundation for leadership. One of his first realizations was simple and unsettling. Britain was not ready. Military resources were stretched thin. Allies were unstable. Morale was fragile. Victory was not a plan, it was a hope. Churchill did not pretend otherwise. Instead of offering reassurance, he offered reality. His speeches acknowledged fear openly. He spoke of sacrifice, of endurance, of struggle without guarantees. This honesty was not comforting, but it was grounding. People listened because they sensed something rare: sincerity without performance. Behind closed doors, however, the pressure was relentless. Churchill carried the memory of Gallipoli like a shadow. Every military briefing reopened old doubts. Every risky decision echoed past failures. He understood better than most how quickly boldness could turn into catastrophe. This awareness did not paralyze him. It sharpened him. He questioned commanders aggressively. He challenged assumptions. He demanded contingency upon contingency. Some found his intensity exhausting. Others found it necessary. Churchill did not seek consensus. He sought preparedness. The evacuation at Dunkirk tested this approach. On paper, it was a retreat. In reality, it was a rescue balanced on the edge of disaster. The outcome was uncertain until the final moment. Success depended on weather, improvisation, and luck. Churchill understood something crucial about this moment. How it would be framed mattered almost as much as how it unfolded. When the evacuation succeeded beyond expectation, he resisted the temptation to celebrate prematurely. He framed it carefully, not as victory, but as survival, not as triumph, but as resolve. This restraint preserved credibility, because the war was far from over. As Germany advanced and Britain stood increasingly alone, Churchill faced decisions that carried moral complexity. Alliances were not pure. Compromises were unavoidable. Survival demanded cooperation with powers that did not share Britain's values. Churchill accepted this without illusion. He understood that moral clarity in wartime often emerges only in hindsight. In the moment, leadership requires choosing the least destructive option, not the cleanest one. This understanding weighed heavily on him. Privately, Churchill wrestled with doubt. Confidence, so visible in public, was often an act of discipline rather than belief. He experienced bouts of anxiety, periods of exhaustion, and moments of deep uncertainty. But he learned not to display them, not because he felt above fear, but because he understood its contagious nature. Fear spreads faster than facts. And so Churchill controlled the tone of the nation by controlling his own. His speeches became anchors predictable in rhythm, firm in language, steady in intent. They did not promise escape. They promised continuity. You will endure. You will persist. You will remain. These messages mattered more than strategy in the darkest moments. As the war expanded, Churchill's role evolved. He became not just a national leader, but a symbol. This carried both power and distortion. The public image of Churchill hardened into something singular, defiant, confident, immovable. The man behind the image felt the weight of this simplification. He was no longer allowed complexity. Doubt had to be hidden. Fatigue had to be masked. Vulnerability had no place in public view. Leadership demanded constancy even when the inner landscape shifted daily. This dissonance took its toll. Churchill worked obsessively. Sleep became fragmented. Meals were irregular. Stress accumulated without release. Yet he resisted withdrawal. He believed presence itself was a form of leadership. To disappear, even briefly, felt dangerous. The war also forced Churchill into constant negotiation. Allies brought their own priorities, their own fears, their own ambitions. Cooperation required patience he did not naturally possess. He argued fiercely. He compromised reluctantly. He navigated personalities as carefully as battle plans. Not all of these relationships were stable. Tension was constant. Trust was provisional. Churchill learned that leadership at scale is less about command than coordination. Authority does not eliminate disagreement, it manages it. And management requires restraint as much as resolve. This lesson did not come easily. There were moments when Churchill's instincts clashed with reality, when his desire for decisive action collided with logistical limits, when optimism threatened to outpace resources. Each time, he adjusted not without friction, but with growing discipline. These adjustments marked a subtle transformation. The man once known for impatience was learning endurance. The man once dismissed as reckless was becoming measured, not because he had changed fundamentally, but because circumstances demanded it. As the tide of war slowly began to shift, Churchill resisted the temptation to assume permanence. He understood that leadership is conditional, that admiration is temporary, that power, once granted, can be withdrawn without warning. This awareness kept him alert. He did not govern as if victory were guaranteed. He governed as if failure were always possible. And this mindset, formed through years of rejection, sharpened through crisis, became his greatest strength. But even as success approached, something unexpected awaited him, because war would eventually end. And when it did, Churchill would discover that survival and gratitude are not the same thing. What the nation needed during collapse was not necessarily what it wanted after recovery, and that realization would arrive quietly, later. For now, Churchill remained at his post, holding together not just a country, but an idea of continuity itself, and doing so at a cost that would only become visible long after. Victory does not arrive cleanly. It arrives tangled with exhaustion, compromise, and a quiet sense of disorientation. As the war turned in favor of the Allies, Winston Churchill faced a paradox he had not prepared for. The role that had defined him, wartime leader, voice of endurance, symbol of resistance, was slowly becoming obsolete. The danger he had been built to confront was retreating, and with it, the clarity that crisis provides. During the final years of the war, Churchill's days were consumed by coordination rather than survival. Strategy replaced emergency. Negotiation replaced urgency. The battlefield widened, not just geographically, but politically. Decisions now involved borders, futures, and spheres of influence rather than immediate defense. These decisions were heavier in a different way. They carried consequences that would not reveal themselves for decades. Churchill understood this more than most. He had always been preoccupied with legacy, how actions echo beyond the moment. Now, he was helping shape a post-war world without the certainty that his instincts still applied. The alliances that had been forged under pressure began to strain under relief. Shared enemies had masked deep differences. As victory approached, those differences resurfaced. Churchill navigated this terrain with caution and unease. He had never trusted idealism in politics. He believed peace was not maintained by hope alone, but by structure, deterrence, and vigilance. This belief placed him increasingly at odds with visions of a harmonious post-war order. Once again, he found himself warning when others were celebrating, but the world had changed. The public mood shifted quickly. Years of sacrifice had created a hunger for normalcy. People wanted rebuilding, not vigilance. Stability, not speeches. Reassurance, not reminders of fragility. Churchill's tone, so effective during crisis, began to feel heavy. His speeches still carried gravity, but gravity was no longer what the public wanted. They wanted lightness. They wanted distance from fear. And fear was what Churchill understood best. As the war concluded, the nation prepared for peace with the same urgency it had once prepared for survival. Elections were scheduled, futures were debated, new priorities emerged. Churchill, still focused on global stability and long-term risk, found himself increasingly disconnected from domestic concerns. Housing shortages, economic reform, social welfare, these were not the battles he had trained for. Leadership, once again, was changing its shape. When the election results arrived, they were definitive. Churchill lost, not narrowly, decisively. The nation he had helped save chose a different direction. Gratitude did not translate into loyalty. Admiration did not guarantee power. For Churchill, the loss was disorienting. He had not expected permanence, but he had not expected rejection so quickly. The transition from indispensable to replaceable was abrupt. Applause faded into procedure. Authority dissolved into routine. History moved on. Once more, Churchill found himself outside the center of power, watching a world he had helped preserve, reorganize without him. This time, however, the silence felt different. He was older, more tired, more aware of his limits. The rejection did not ignite the same defiance it once had. Instead, it produced a quieter reckoning. Churchill reflected on the pattern of his life: rise, fall, return, removal. He recognized something painful and instructive. His greatest strength had always been situational. He excelled when danger was undeniable. He struggled when complexity replaced urgency. This realization did not diminish his sense of purpose, but it reframed it. Churchill turned again to writing, not as survival, but as preservation. He documented events meticulously, aware that memory, left unattended, becomes distorted. He sought to shape understanding, not through authority, but through record. In doing so, he reclaimed a different kind of influence. His warnings did not stop. Even out of office, he spoke of emerging divisions, of ideological tension, of a world reorganizing itself around new fears. He described a future shaped by mistrust and deterrence rather than unity. Many listened this time, not because he held power, but because history had validated his instincts before. Yet, despite this renewed attention, Churchill remained fundamentally displaced. He was no longer aligned with the moment. His energy belonged to an earlier crisis. His identity had been forged under pressure that peace could not replicate. This mismatch created restlessness. He returned briefly to leadership later, but the role no longer fit as it once had. The pace was slower, the challenges were diffuse, the urgency that had sustained him was absent. Churchill felt this absence deeply. Physically, the years had accumulated. Fatigue lingered. Health declined. The relentless drive that had once overridden limitation now encountered resistance. He slowed not willingly, but inevitably. As his public life receded, reflection took its place. Churchill considered how history would remember him. He understood the temptation of myth, the simplification of narrative. He knew that future generations would compress complexity into symbols. This did not comfort him. He had lived too fully in contradiction to believe in clean legacies. He knew his failures were real, his misjudgments documented, his ambition often excessive. And yet he also knew that in a moment of collapse he had held the line. That knowledge mattered, but it did not erase the cost. The loneliness that had defined his early life returned in a new form, not as obscurity, but as distance. He had become a figure more often referenced than consulted, more often quoted than understood. This distance widened as time passed. Churchill aged into symbolism while still alive, a strange position for a man who had always resisted abstraction. He had been flesh and urgency, not marble and memory, and now he watched himself become history. This transformation was not gentle. It required surrendering relevance piece by piece. It required accepting that influence does not always endure, even when impact does. Churchill did not disappear quietly, but he did fade, and in that fading, the final shape of his legacy began to form not as uninterrupted triumph, but as a sequence of moments where readiness met necessity. What remained was not perfection. The final years of Winston Churchill's life were not defined by action, but by accumulation. Memories accumulated, interpretations accumulated, judgments accumulated, often louder than facts. By the time he fully withdrew from public life, Churchill had become something separate from himself. He was no longer simply a man who had lived through history. He was a reference point, a symbol, a shorthand for endurance. This transformation was gradual and deeply unsettling. Churchill had always believed that history was shaped by individuals, not abstractions. Yet now, he was being reduced into one. His speeches were quoted without their context. His image circulated without his doubts. His confidence was remembered without his hesitation. The man was being edited. Churchill watched this process unfold with mixed emotion. Part of him understood it as inevitable. Memory simplifies because complexity is difficult to carry forward. But another part of him resisted it. He knew how dangerous simplification could be, because simplification removes warning. It transforms hard-earned lessons into decoration. As age slowed him physically, his mind remained active. He read extensively, reflected obsessively, and continued to write. Writing, once again, became the place where he could restore nuance, where he could insist that history was not neat and leadership was not clean. He revisited moments of choice, not to glorify them but to examine them. Churchill understood that future generations would judge his decisions without the weight of uncertainty he had carried. They would see outcomes, not probabilities, results, not risks. This gap troubled him. because he knew that judgment without uncertainty breeds arrogance. He also knew that legacy is rarely controlled by those who leave it behind. As years passed, public appearances became rarer. When Churchill did appear, crowds treated him with reverence. Applause came easily. Respect was unquestioned. Yet the connection felt distant, ceremonial. The urgency that once animated him was gone, and with it, the sense of necessity. Churchill had always been most alive when something was at stake, when events demanded response, when time mattered. Without that pressure, life slowed into observation rather than participation. This shift forced reflection. He thought often about failure, not as regret, but as instruction. Gallipoli returned to him not as a wound, but as a reminder of limits. He understood that without that failure, he might not have learned restraint. Without humiliation, he might not have developed endurance. He recognized that his life had been shaped as much by rejection as by acceptance. Perhaps more, Churchill also reconsidered ambition. The drive that had propelled him forward had cost him relationships, health, and peace. It had kept him relevant but never comfortable. He questioned whether any outcome could truly justify that cost. There were no clear answers, only recognition. As his health declined, the world around him accelerated. New conflicts emerged, new leaders rose, new ideologies formed. Churchill observed these developments with concern, but also with distance. His influence had shifted from intervention to commentary, and commentary, he knew, does not stop events. It only records them. In his final years, Churchill became acutely aware of time not as urgency, but as boundary. He measured days differently, not by productivity, but by presence. Moments became smaller, quieter, yet even in decline, his mind remained disciplined. He resisted bitterness. He avoided nostalgia. He did not romanticize the past. He treated it as something completed, not something to be relived. This restraint was deliberate. Churchill understood that clinging to relevance can distort memory. It turns reflection into justification. He preferred honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. As he approached the end of his life, public discussion of his legacy intensified. He was praised as indispensable, criticized as flawed, debated as symbol and substance. Churchill did not respond. Silence, at this stage, felt appropriate. He had spent a lifetime speaking into uncertainty. Now certainty no longer required his voice. The record existed. The consequences were unfolding. Interpretation belonged to others. This surrender was not weakness. It was acceptance. When Churchill died, the response was global. Ceremonies were elaborate, tributes were extensive. History paused to acknowledge him. For a moment, his presence filled the space he had vacated. And then, as it always does, time resumed. What remained was not a single narrative, but a tension. Churchill was remembered as resolute, but also stubborn, visionary, but also reckless, necessary, but not universally admired. His life resisted simple moral packaging. This resistance is important because it preserves truth. Churchill's legacy is not that he was always right. It is that he was prepared when hesitation was fatal, that he endured when collapse seemed rational, that he spoke when silence felt safer. But it is also that he failed, that he misjudged, that he carried the consequences of those misjudgments openly. This duality is the most honest inheritance he leaves behind, not a model to be copied, but a case to be studied. Long after Churchill, the world continues to face moments where certainty dissolves and pressure rises, moments where leadership is demanded without instruction, moments where choices must be made without guarantee. In those moments, his life offers no comfort, but it offers perspective. It reminds us that leadership is not about clarity, it is about responsibility, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the discipline to act within it, that legacy is not created by intention alone, but by consequence. Churchill did not control how history would remember him. No one does. But he shaped the conditions under which memory formed, and that shaping, imperfect, costly, and human is what endures. Long after the speeches fade, long after the statues weather, long after the name becomes reference rather than presence, what remains is not the man. It is the weight of having stood when standing mattered, and that weight, once carried, does not disappear. It transfers. There is a quiet distortion that happens after greatness, not immediately, not deliberately, but gradually through repetition. Stories are told again and again until the sharp edges soften. Motives are simplified. Context is compressed. What was once uncertain becomes inevitable. What was once contested becomes obvious. This is how history makes itself easier to carry. Winston Churchill understood this process better than most. He had spent his life shaping narratives, reframing events, and resisting versions of reality that felt incomplete. Now, after his death, that same process was being applied to him, and it changed him. In popular memory, Churchill became singular, the wartime leader, the defiant voice, the embodiment of resolve. This image was powerful, but narrow. It left little room for contradiction, little room for evolution, little room for the long stretches of doubt, misjudgment, and irrelevance that had defined so much of his life. What disappeared first was uncertainty. Yet uncertainty had been the environment in which Churchill operated most honestly. He did not lead from foresight, he led from probability, from instinct sharpened by failure, from judgment formed under pressure. When that uncertainty is removed, his decisions appear cleaner than they were. And cleaner decisions are easier to admire but harder to learn from. As decades passed, Churchill's speeches were excerpted, isolated from their moments. Phrases were repeated without the fear that had shaped them. Confidence was quoted without the exhaustion that sustained it. The voice remained. The cost faded. This selective memory created a problem. Churchill began to be invoked as justification rather than example. His defiance was cited to support rigidity. His resolve was used to defend inflexibility. His legacy was employed to simplify new crises that bore little resemblance to the one he faced. He became a symbol of certainty, which he never was. This transformation says more about how societies remember than about how leaders lead. Memory prefers clarity, ambiguity demands effort, and so complexity is often discarded. But discarding complexity carries consequences. It creates unrealistic standards for leadership. It encourages myth over method. It replaces judgment with imitation. Churchill himself warned against this tendency. He believed that history, when treated as moral theater, loses its instructional value. It becomes performance rather than preparation. His life, stripped of context, risks becoming exactly that. To understand what remains long after Churchill, one must resist admiration long enough to ask harder questions. Why did he succeed when others failed? The answer is not courage alone, nor intelligence, nor rhetoric. It is timing. Churchill's temperament, so often a liability, became an asset only when circumstances aligned with it. His stubbornness was useful when compromise was dangerous. His pessimism was valuable when optimism was dishonest. His appetite for risk mattered when stagnation was fatal. In calmer times, these traits isolated him. This is not a flaw. It is a reminder that leadership is situational. Churchill was not universally effective. He was acutely effective at a particular moment in history. That moment elevated him. Outside of it, his limitations were visible. This reality complicates his legacy, but it also makes it more usable because it teaches discernment rather than devotion. Another distortion emerges around endurance. Churchill is often remembered as indefatigable, unyielding, tireless, immune to fatigue. This image ignores the toll leadership took on him. His struggles with anxiety, his dependence on routine, his periods of deep exhaustion. Endurance, in his case, was not effortless. It was managed. He compensated for weakness through structure. He offset doubt with preparation. He maintained function not through inspiration, but through discipline. This matters because it reframes resilience not as innate strength, but as sustained effort. Churchill did not endure because he was immune to fear. He endured because he organized himself around it. This distinction is frequently lost in simplified retellings. So too is the role of luck. History often hesitates to acknowledge chance. It prefers causality. Yet Churchill's life intersected repeatedly with unpredictable variables: weather, timing, personalities, accidents. Some decisions succeeded because circumstances allowed them to. Others failed because they did not. Acknowledging this does not diminish Churchill's role. It humanizes it. It reminds us that leadership operates within constraints it does not control. This humility is essential if history is to inform rather than mislead. Churchill's long-term impact is perhaps most visible not in policy but in precedent. He demonstrated that leadership could coexist with uncertainty, that honesty could be stabilizing, that acknowledging difficulty could generate trust. These lessons outlast specific events, but they are subtle. They do not lend themselves to slogans, which makes them vulnerable to erosion. As new generations encounter Churchill primarily through abstraction, the challenge becomes preservation of nuance. Without it, his legacy risks becoming ornamental, invoked, but not understood. This erosion is not inevitable. It can be resisted through careful attention to contradiction. Churchill's failures matter because they explain his successes. His impatience matters because it contextualizes his resolve. His isolation matters because it explains his independence. Remove these elements, and what remains is incomplete. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Churchill's life is not about leadership at all. It is about preparation. He spent years being wrong publicly and right privately. Years refining instincts without authority. Years learning restraint through irrelevance. When opportunity finally arrived, he was not learning from scratch. He was applying accumulated experience. This preparation was invisible at the time. It is invisible now, but it is essential. Great moments rarely announce themselves in advance. They emerge from long periods of obscurity. Those who endure those periods without disappearing entirely are the ones history later remembers. Churchill endured, not heroically, not gracefully, but persistently. And persistence, more than brilliance, is what carried him into relevance when relevance mattered most. Long after Churchill, the temptation remains to search history for certainty, to find figures who reassure rather than challenge. But the value of his life lies precisely in its discomfort. It resists easy admiration. It demands engagement. It insists that leadership is not a template to be copied, but a context to be understood. If Churchill's legacy is reduced to posture or phrase, it fails. If it is examined as a case full of error, Preparation, timing, and cost, it instructs. That distinction determines whether history becomes decoration or discipline. What remains long after is not a standard to be met. It is a question to be asked. Under what conditions does this work? And at what cost? Churchill never claimed to be an answer, only a response to a moment that required one. There is a temptation, when studying figures like Winston Churchill, to search for lessons that feel universal, rules that can be applied cleanly, principles that promise reliable outcomes. But Churchill's life resists this approach, not because it lacks insight, but because its insight is conditional. The closer one looks, the clearer it becomes that Churchill's effectiveness was never detached from circumstance. His strengths did not exist in isolation. They activated only when paired with a specific kind of crisis, one that demanded resolve more than harmony, persistence more than consensus. This realization unsettles comfortable narratives because it suggests that leadership is not about possessing the right traits, but about matching traits to moments. Churchill's personality was extreme. His confidence bordered on arrogance. His stubbornness strained relationships. His impatience disrupted process. In stable times, these qualities created friction. They slowed cooperation. They damaged trust. But in instability, they became assets. When systems faltered and caution became paralysis, Churchill's refusal to yield created momentum. When ambiguity threatened morale, his certainty, however, constructed, offered direction. This does not make him exceptional in all contexts. It makes him precise. Churchill was not broadly adaptable. He was acutely situational. This precision is often misunderstood as greatness in the abstract. Yet, abstract greatness obscures responsibility. It removes the requirement to understand context. It encourages imitation where analysis is needed. Churchill himself avoided this trap. He did not believe in permanent answers. He believed in appropriate responses. His writing reflects this repeatedly. He treated history not as a guidebook, but as a record of consequences. Consequences were always his focus. Throughout his life, Churchill remained unusually aware of aftermath. He thought beyond decisions into repercussions, political, social, psychological. This awareness fueled his anxiety, but it also informed his caution. Even at his most aggressive, he calculated cost, not always accurately, but always consciously. This consciousness matters because it distinguishes recklessness from risk. Churchill embraced risk, but he did not deny danger. He acknowledged uncertainty openly. His confidence was not rooted in prediction, but in endurance, the belief that Britain could withstand what came next, whatever it was. This belief shaped his leadership style. He did not govern by promising outcomes. He governed by preparing minds. His speeches conditioned the public for hardship rather than shielding them from it. He did not seek to eliminate fear. He sought to organize it. Fear, when unmanaged, fragments. Fear, when acknowledged, can unify. This was one of Churchill's most intuitive insights. He understood collective psychology instinctively, not through theory, but through observation. He sensed when reassurance would feel dishonest and when severity would feel stabilizing. This intuition did not emerge suddenly during the war. It was cultivated. Years of rejection had trained him to read rooms that were not welcoming. Years of being ignored had sharpened his awareness of audience fatigue. He knew when words landed and when they didn't because he had lived through both. In this sense, obscurity was his education. Without it, he might have mistaken applause for truth. Churchill also learned restraint late. Early in life, he spoke compulsively, often without regard for consequence. Over time, he began to choose emphasis rather than volume. This evolution is subtle but significant. By the time he reached power, his language was focused, not softer but narrower. He understood that clarity requires limitation, that saying less can carry more weight, that repetition, when deliberate, builds trust. This discipline separated his wartime rhetoric from mere performance. Yet even as he refined his public voice, his private life remained turbulent. Relationships suffered, health declined, stress accumulated without release. Leadership extracted payment in forms that applause could not offset. This imbalance shaped his later years. Churchill never truly recovered from the intensity of the war. Peace did not restore him, it displaced him. Without constant urgency, his internal equilibrium faltered. The routines that had sustained him under pressure lost relevance. This suggests a difficult truth. Some people are built for crisis, and crisis, once gone, leaves a vacuum. Churchill lived with this vacuum. He tried to fill it with writing, reflection, and periodic returns to office. But the alignment between his temperament and circumstance never fully returned. This does not diminish his achievements. It contextualizes them. Churchill's life demonstrates that effectiveness is often temporary, that alignment between individual and moment is rare and fleeting, that success when it arrives must be understood as convergence rather than destiny. This understanding protects against idolization. It invites study instead. When Churchill is studied rather than celebrated, his contradictions become instructive. His failures illuminate his adjustments. His misjudgments explain his later caution. His isolation clarifies his independence. This layered view offers something more valuable than inspiration. It offers discernment. Discernment asks different questions. Not who was great, but why did this work here? Not what should be copied, but what conditions made this possible? These questions matter long after personalities fade, because history repeats patterns, not people. Churchill's pattern is one of preparation through exclusion, of refinement through failure, of relevance earned slowly and exercised briefly. This pattern challenges modern assumptions about success. It resists the idea of linear progress. It contradicts narratives of constant growth. It shows that readiness can develop during decline. This is uncomfortable but realistic. Churchill did not rise smoothly. He accumulated experience unevenly. He endured irrelevance without disappearing entirely. When circumstances shifted, he was positioned, not elevated. This positioning was not accidental. It was maintained. Despite ridicule, despite dismissal, despite fatigue, Churchill remained engaged. He continued to think, to write, to observe. He did not retreat into resentment. He did not surrender to nostalgia. He waited. Waiting, in his case, was not passive. It was preparatory. This distinction is often lost when his life is compressed into heroic shorthand, but it is essential if his legacy is to remain useful. Because waiting without certainty, without affirmation, without reward is where many lives are shaped. Churchill's endurance during these periods is more instructive than his speeches during crisis. It teaches patience without complacency. It shows that relevance cannot be forced, but readiness can be maintained. Long after Churchill, this lesson remains, not as motivation, but as orientation. History does not reward constant visibility. It rewards sustained engagement. Those who continue thinking when ignored, preparing when sidelined, and refining when rejected are often the ones positioned to respond when circumstances shift. Churchill did not know when his moment would arrive. He only knew that abandoning preparation would guarantee irrelevance. So he persisted, not optimistically, not peacefully, but deliberately. And when history finally demanded response, deliberation mattered more than brilliance. This is not a comfortable legacy. It does not flatter ambition, but it endures because it speaks to the long intervals between moments and the discipline required to survive them intact. What remains long after is not Churchill's certainty, it is his preparedness. When the noise finally fades, what remains is not achievement, but impact. Long after Winston Churchill's voice fell silent, the world continued to move through structures shaped during his lifetime. Some of those structures were deliberate, others emerged unintentionally. Many carried consequences he never fully anticipated. This is where legacy becomes complicated. Churchill did not design a future. He responded to a moment, yet responses, especially at scale, ripple outward. They harden into systems. They influence decisions made by people who never experienced the original crisis. Over time, what began as necessity becomes precedent. Churchill understood this risk. He worried not just about winning a war, but about what winning would justify. He questioned how emergency measures might be normalized, how extraordinary authority might redefine acceptable power. These concerns rarely appeared in public speeches, but they shaped his private thinking. Because Churchill knew something history often forgets, survival changes standards. What is tolerated during collapse can linger long after collapse ends. The post-war world bore this out. Borders were drawn under pressure, alliances formed out of fear. Institutions were created to prevent repetition, but often carried the imprint of urgency rather than reflection. Churchill's influence threaded through many of these outcomes, not as architect, but as accelerant. His insistence on firmness shaped deterrence. His suspicion of idealism shaped realism. His emphasis on preparedness shaped policy. These orientations became embedded, yet embedded influence is difficult to evaluate. It cannot be traced cleanly to decisions. It appears instead as posture, how states react, how leaders speak, how threats are framed. In this sense, Churchill's legacy is psychological as much as political. He helped normalize the idea that uncertainty requires strength rather than denial. This idea persisted, but it also hardened. Over time, firmness risked becoming rigidity, preparedness risked becoming paranoia, vigilance risked becoming suspicion. These were not outcomes Churchill intended, but they were not entirely unpredictable either. This is the burden of consequence. Leaders act within moments. History absorbs those actions into systems. Churchill lived long enough to see some of this absorption begin. He watched as the language of endurance became the language of division, as caution transformed into opposition, as the world reorganized itself around tension rather than recovery. He spoke about this openly, not triumphantly but warily. His warnings about ideological division were not calls for confrontation. They were acknowledgments of fracture. He understood that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the management of difference. This distinction mattered to him deeply. Churchill had never believed in permanent solutions. He believed in temporary balances, in vigilance rather than victory, in stability achieved through effort rather than optimism. This worldview shaped the decades that followed him. Whether that shaping was beneficial remains debated, and perhaps it should remain debated, because unquestioned legacy is not legacy, it is mythology. Churchill's long-term impact is inseparable from the systems that outlived him. Some provided security, others entrenched division, some preserved peace, others prolonged tension. This ambiguity is not failure, it is reality. Churchill did not govern with the expectation of moral clarity in hindsight. He governed with the awareness that outcomes would be judged differently over time. He accepted this risk not because he dismissed it, but because he understood that indecision carried its own consequences. This acceptance is often misinterpreted as certainty. It was not. It was resolve under constraint. Churchill never claimed to know the future. He claimed only that inaction carried danger, that hesitation had cost lives before, that delay, when threat was visible, could be fatal. This logic resonated deeply in a world recovering from collapse. It still resonates, but resonance without context can mislead. The danger of Churchill's legacy is not in his decisions, but in their abstraction. When firmness is admired without restraint, when endurance is praised without cost, when defiance is celebrated without discernment, these distortions flatten history. They turn response into doctrine. Churchill's life warns against this transformation. He did not seek permanence. He sought adequacy. Adequacy to moment, adequacy to threat, adequacy to responsibility. Once the moment passed, his adequacy declined. He recognized this. He accepted replacement. He did not cling to relevance beyond his usefulness. This humility is rarely emphasized, yet it is central. Churchill understood that leadership has expiration, that no temperament suits all conditions, that power, when held too long, becomes misaligned. This understanding shaped his willingness, however, reluctantly to step aside. It also shapes how his legacy should be approached, not as instruction, but as case study. Case studies are valuable precisely because they resist generalization. They demand context. They invite critique. They preserve contradiction. Churchill's life is rich with contradiction. He defended democracy through authoritarian measures. He spoke for freedom while navigating empire. He warned against tyranny while exercising extraordinary control. These tensions are not errors in the record. They are the record. To remember Churchill honestly is to remember him incompletely, to accept that no narrative captures the full weight of his decisions, that every summary leaves something out, that every tribute obscures cost. This incompleteness is not a flaw, it is an invitation to examine leadership without romance, to confront consequence without simplification, to study endurance without glorification. Long after Churchill, these invitations remain unanswered by many, but they remain available. His life does not offer comfort. It offers challenge. It asks whether we can hold complexity without retreating into myth, whether we can admire resolve without excusing harm, whether we can learn from history without turning it into instruction manual. Churchill himself doubted that history would do this well. He knew how easily memory distorts, and yet he continued to write, to document, to argue, not because he expected agreement, but because he believed record mattered. That belief endures long after speeches fade, long after statues wither, long after names become shorthand. What remains is not certainty, it is responsibility. Responsibility to remember fully, responsibility to judge carefully, responsibility to resist ease. Churchill's life does not simplify the past. It complicates the future, and in that complication lies its lasting value. Time does something subtle to historical figures. It does not erase them. It reframes them. As decades pass, questions shift. The urgency that once defined decisions dissolves, and in its place comes evaluation. Not of survival, but of meaning, not of necessity, but of consequence. This is where Winston Churchill's legacy enters its most demanding phase, because distance removes excuses. What once felt unavoidable is re-examined. What once felt justified is reconsidered. What once felt heroic is weighed against what followed. Churchill knew this would happen. He understood that time would loosen the grip of circumstance and tighten the grip of judgment, that future generations would ask not what choice was possible, but what choice was right. These are different questions, and understanding the difference is essential to understanding his life. Churchill made decisions in a world compressed by threat. Speed mattered, delay carried risk. Information arrived incomplete and often contradictory. In that environment, judgment functioned differently. It favored decisiveness over precision, momentum over balance. But time does not honor urgency, it honors outcome. As the years passed, scholars, critics, and citizens began to re-examine Churchill not as leader, but as influence. They traced patterns outward from his choices into later policies, from his worldview into inherited assumptions. This re-examination was uneven. Some defended him absolutely, others condemned him categorically. Both positions simplified reality. The truth resisted alignment. Churchill's worldview was shaped by empire, hierarchy, and power. He believed order required authority, and authority required strength. These beliefs were not unusual for his generation, but they became increasingly uncomfortable as global values shifted. This discomfort is often projected backward as moral failure, but projection obscure contexte. Understanding Churchill does not require endorsement of his views. It requires recognizing how those views operated within his time and how their consequences extended beyond it. He did not imagine himself as progressive, he imagined himself as protective. His concern was stability, not transformation, continuity, not reform. This orientation influenced how he approached conflict, governance, and international relations. It also limited him. Churchill struggled to adapt to worlds that demanded redistribution rather than defense, inclusion rather than control. His instincts were forged in crisis, not reconstruction. When the nature of challenge changed, his effectiveness declined. This decline is not often discussed, because decline disrupts heroism. Yet it is essential to honest memory. Churchill's life demonstrates that leadership competence is not permanent. It fluctuates with context. It can peak dramatically and recede just as clearly. This fluctuation does not diminish achievement. It clarifies it. The temptation to freeze Churchill at his peak to remember him only as wartime leader is understandable. Peaks are easier to admire than slopes, but slopes contain instruction. They show where strengths stop working. They reveal the boundaries of judgment. Churchill's post-war years illustrate this boundary clearly. His warnings remained sharp, but his solutions grew less aligned with emerging realities. His voice carried authority, but his prescriptions felt increasingly rigid. He sensed this, and it troubled him. Churchill was not blind to his limitations. He recognized when energy outpaced capacity, when temperament mismatched moment. This recognition did not eliminate frustration, but it moderated entitlement. He did not claim ownership over the future. He accepted displacement. This acceptance is rarely included in summaries of his life, yet it speaks volumes. It reveals a man who understood that relevance is not owed even to those who once saved nations. This humility coexisted with pride. Churchill never disavowed his decisions. He defended them vigorously. But defense is not denial. He acknowledged trade-offs. He accepted cost. He did not pretend purity. This realism distinguishes him from myth. Myth demands perfection. History demands accounting. Churchill belongs to the second category. As reassessment continues, his legacy remains unsettled. Debates persist, not because evidence is lacking, but because interpretation depends on values. Values change, history stays. This tension ensures that Churchill remains contested, and that is appropriate. Figures who matter should resist closure. If Churchill were easy to classify, he would be less instructive. His contradictions force engagement. They prevent comfortable admiration. They demand sustained attention. This demand is part of his long-term impact. He does not offer a moral template. He offers a record of decision-making under extreme pressure, a record of endurance shaped by preparation, a record of failure absorbed into function. These elements remain relevant precisely because they are not clean. Modern leaders face different threats, but similar uncertainty, different technologies but similar compression, different stakes but similar consequences. Churchill's life does not tell them what to do. It shows them what it costs. It shows that leadership extracts payment in health, relationships, clarity, and peace. That decisiveness isolates. That responsibility accumulates silently. These costs persist across eras. Long after Churchill, the world continues to seek certainty in figures rather than systems. It searches for voices rather than structures. It elevates personality where process is needed. This tendency repeats. Churchill's legacy warns against it, not because he was flawed, but because he was effective only when conditions aligned, when personality filled a vacuum that systems could not. Once systems recovered, personality became secondary. This transition matters. It suggests that reliance on individuals signals systemic weakness, that the need for extraordinary leadership reflects ordinary failure. Churchill understood this instinctively. He did not desire permanent emergency. He recognized that his relevance depended on abnormal conditions. When those conditions ended, so did his centrality. This awareness separates him from those who cling to power beyond usefulness. It does not absolve him of critique, but it frames his role accurately. As time continues to widen, Churchill's figure will keep shifting. New generations will reinterpret him through new concerns. Some will emphasize his defiance, others his imperial views, some his rhetoric, others his restraint. There is a final illusion that history creates. That distance brings clarity. In truth, distance often brings comfort. It softens edges, organizes chaos, and turns lived uncertainty into clean sequence. The more time passes, the easier it becomes to believe that outcomes were obvious, that leaders merely followed visible paths toward inevitable ends. Winston Churchill's life resists this illusion, but only if it is examined carefully, because nothing about his trajectory was inevitable. Not his rise, not his survival, not his relevance. Each depended on fragile intersections of timing, temperament, and circumstance. Remove any one of them, and the outcome shifts. This fragility is rarely emphasized. Instead, Churchill is often remembered as destiny fulfilled, as though history had been waiting for him, patiently clearing obstacles until he arrived. This narrative is comforting. It suggests order. It implies that crises produce their own solutions. But history does not work that way. Churchill did not emerge because the moment demanded him. He emerged because he remained present long enough for the moment to find him. And even then, acceptance was reluctant, provisional, and temporary. This distinction matters because it reframes leadership not as arrival but as endurance. Churchill endured obscurity, ridicule, failure, and misalignment. He endured periods where his voice had no effect, where his preparation appeared pointless, where his confidence looked misplaced. Most people disappear at this stage. They withdraw, they adapt downward, they trade preparation for comfort. Churchill did not because he was certain, but because uncertainty had become familiar. He had learned to operate without affirmation, to function without applause, to prepare without promise. This capacity to continue without reward is perhaps the most transferable aspect of his life, not his rhetoric, not his authority, but his persistence during irrelevance. History celebrates moments. Lives are shaped in intervals. Churchill's intervals were long stretches where effort produced no visible return, where insight did not translate into influence, where warning generated annoyance rather than action. These stretches did not weaken him, they recalibrated him, they stripped away illusion, they forced him to confront his limitations, they taught him restraint through exclusion. By the time power arrived, he was no longer intoxicated by it. This is why he could relinquish it later. People who earn relevance easily often cling to it desperately. People who fight for it over decades understand its conditional nature. Churchill belonged to the second category. He never assumed permanence. Even at the height of authority, he spoke and acted with an awareness that circumstances could turn, that public support could dissolve. That necessity, once gone, would take legitimacy with it. This awareness shaped his restraint. It also shaped his acceptance of removal. Churchill's electoral defeat after the war remains one of the most misunderstood moments of his life. It is often framed as ingratitude on the part of the public, as betrayal, as proof of political blindness. But this framing misses something essential. The public did not reject Churchill's past. They rejected his future. They no longer needed the man he was built to be. They needed reconstruction, redistribution, and domestic reform. Churchill's strengths, defiance, vigilance, endurance were no longer primary. This transition was not moral. It was functional. Churchill understood this, even if he felt its sting. He did not argue that he should remain because of what he had done. He recognized that leadership must align with present needs, not past achievements. This recognition is rare. It suggests a view of power not as reward but as responsibility granted conditionally. Once conditions change, responsibility shifts. Churchill accepted this intellectually before he accepted it emotionally. Emotionally, the transition was difficult. Identity does not dissolve on command. A man who has carried the weight of survival does not easily step into irrelevance. The silence that follows crisis can feel heavier than the crisis itself. Churchill lived with this silence. He filled it with writing, reflection, and observation. He did not seek reinvention. He did not chase relevance through performance. He allowed his role to narrow. This narrowing preserved dignity. It also preserved accuracy. Churchill did not attempt to extend his authority beyond its natural span. He did not force his voice into conversations where it no longer fit. He spoke when he believed consequence demanded it, and withdrew when it did not. This selective engagement contrasts sharply with how he is often remembered, as relentless, ever-present, dominating. In reality, he learned when to step back. This learning was slow, but it mattered. As his life receded into history, Churchill's story became easier to tell than to understand. Narrative simplified, complexity faded. The long preparation was compressed into brief prelude. The years of doubt became footnotes. This compression is convenient. It is also misleading, because it encourages the belief that readiness can be improvised, that resilience appears when needed, that leadership emerges fully formed at the moment of demand. Churchill's life contradicts this belief. Readiness took decades. Resilience took cost. Leadership took alignment. None were automatic. Long after Churchill, societies continue to search for figures who can step into crisis instantly. They underestimate preparation. They overestimate charisma. They confuse visibility with readiness. This confusion repeats. Churchill's life offers a counter-example not through instruction but through structure. It shows that the capacity to respond under pressure is built slowly, often invisibly, and frequently without reward. That those who survive irrelevance intact are the ones positioned to respond when relevance returns. This is not inspiring. It is demanding. It asks for patience without reassurance, effort without affirmation, commitment without certainty. There is a point in every long life shaped by public demand where memory overtakes experience. The man becomes less present than the idea of him. For Winston Churchill, this transition was slow but unmistakable. By the later years of his life, he was no longer primarily engaged with events. Events were engaging with his legacy. His words were replayed more often than they were spoken. His past decisions were discussed more often than his current thoughts. He was becoming historical while still alive. This position is disorienting. To be remembered before being finished creates distance from the present. It turns reflection into rehearsal. Every appearance carries expectation. Every statement is measured not for usefulness, but for consistency with an image already fixed. Churchill felt this pressure. He was aware that his public presence now served symbolic rather than functional purpose. His authority came less from influence than from memory. People listened not to be guided, but to be reassured by continuity. This role did not suit him naturally. Churchill had never been comfortable as ornament. He valued action over reverence, debate over ceremony. Yet he recognized that resistance to this shift would only distort what remained of his agency. So he adjusted. He spoke less frequently, but with greater deliberation. He avoided commentary on matters where his relevance had faded. He conserved attention for issues where consequence outweighed novelty. This restraint marked a final evolution. Earlier in life, Churchill had spoken compulsively, filling space, asserting presence, demanding recognition. Now, he understood that silence could preserve meaning more effectively than speech. This understanding did not come easily. It was learned through fatigue. Years of responsibility had depleted his reserves. His health no longer supported sustained exertion. The routines that had once anchored him under pressure now required effort themselves. Rest was no longer optional. Churchill accepted this reluctantly. Acceptance, however, did not mean disengagement. His mind remained active. He followed world events closely, often with concern. He saw patterns repeating miscalculations, overconfidence, delayed recognition of threat, but he also recognized limits. Recognition without authority carries risk. It can create frustration without remedy. Churchill chose carefully when to intervene, understanding that influence exercised without capacity can weaken credibility. This discipline protected his legacy. It prevented overextension. As time passed, Churchill's role shifted fully into witness. He observed transitions he had helped initiate, but could no longer guide. New leaders interpreted the world through frameworks that had evolved beyond his own. This evolution was inevitable and unsettling. Churchill had always believed in continuity of institutions, of values, of vigilance. Watching those continuities reinterpret themselves required humility. He resisted the impulse to correct every divergence. He understood that history does not preserve intentions, only outcomes. This understanding tempered his judgment. He did not demand fidelity to his vision. He accepted adaptation. This acceptance distinguishes him from figures who mistake legacy for instruction. Churchill did not expect the future to mirror the past. He expected it to respond to different pressures. His concern was not preservation of his ideas, but preservation of preparedness itself. Preparedness, in his view, was a mindset rather than a method. It involved attentiveness, skepticism, and willingness to confront discomfort early rather than late. These qualities transcended policy. They applied regardless of era. This abstraction allowed his influence to persist without rigid adherence. Yet, even abstraction has limits. As global conditions shifted further from those of his formative years, Churchill's framework grew less applicable. Power structures changed, technologies accelerated, threats diversified. He observed these changes with a mixture of concern and resignation. Concern because he recognized familiar patterns beneath new forms. Resignation because he knew that recognition alone could not correct trajectory. This tension between awareness and inability defined his final public posture. He was no longer a driver of events. He was a recorder of risk. This role carries weight but little satisfaction. Churchill had spent his life acting. Now, action was replaced by commentary. The shift was not gentle, but he endured it. When history finally closes around a life, it does not do so with resolution. It closes with distance. Distance between intention and outcome. Distance between action and interpretation. Distance between the person who lived events and the narratives that survive them. Winston Churchill's death did not complete his story. It released it. From that moment on, his life belonged fully to others, to historians, critics, admirers, and those who would invoke his name for purposes he never anticipated. This transfer is unavoidable. It is the final cost of public life. Churchill understood this long before it happened. He knew that once lived experience ends, memory takes over, and memory does not preserve nuance by default. It selects, it emphasizes, it forgets. What survives is rarely balanced. This awareness shaped how Churchill approached his final contributions. He wrote not to justify himself, but to complicate the record. He documented disagreements. He recorded uncertainty. He resisted neat conclusions. He wanted friction preserved, because friction prevents myth. After his death, the immediate response was reverent. Ceremonies framed him as indispensable. Tributes emphasized unity, courage, and resolve. The narrative hardened quickly. This was expected. Moments of loss encourage simplification. They seek coherence. Where reality was fractured, they smooth contradiction to allow collective closure. Churchill became monumental almost overnight. But monuments distort scale. They elevate certain angles while concealing others. They freeze motion into posture. They trade process for position. In this form, Churchill's life risked becoming less instructive, because instruction requires movement. As years passed, reassessment began not as rejection, but as inquiry. Scholars returned to records. Contexts were re-examined. Decisions were revisited without the urgency that once shielded them from scrutiny. This reassessment did not diminish Churchill. It diversified him. It revealed the density of his choices, the constraints under which he operated, the trade-offs he accepted. It restored proportion. Proportion matters. Without it, judgment becomes performance. Praise becomes reflexive. Critique becomes moral exhibition rather than analysis. Churchill's life resists both extremes. It demands proportion. He was neither infallible nor incidental, neither villain nor saint. He was effective under particular conditions and constrained by others. His worldview enabled certain outcomes and limited others. This complexity unsettles because it refuses easy alignment. Yet this refusal is precisely what preserves value. Churchill's legacy, when examined honestly, does not instruct by example, it instructs by exposure. It reveals how power functions under compression, how character interacts with circumstance, how endurance accumulates meaning slowly. These exposures are transferable, not because they prescribe action, but because they sharpen perception. Modern societies often seek certainty in leadership narratives. They prefer figures who confirm existing beliefs. They celebrate decisiveness without examining context. They elevate confidence while ignoring cost. Churchill's life disrupts this pattern. It shows that decisiveness without preparation fails, that confidence without discipline collapses, that endurance without reflection hardens into rigidity. His successes emerged not from singular traits, but from combinations refined over time. This refinement required patience, and patience is rarely celebrated. Churchill waded through irrelevance, ridicule, and dismissal. He waited without assurance that waiting would matter. He prepared without guarantee that preparation would be useful. This waiting is easy to overlook because outcomes dominate memory, but outcomes are visible only at the end. Preparation occupies the longest portion of any life. Its absence or presence determines what happens when conditions change. Churchill's preparation mattered because it was maintained, not because it was rewarded. This distinction is subtle but crucial. The final measure of a historical figure is not how loudly they are remembered, but how carefully they are handled. Winston Churchill's presence in history has never been quiet. His words echo. His image endures. His name is invoked whenever endurance, resolve, or defiance is needed to frame a moment. Yet volume alone does not guarantee understanding. In fact, it often prevents it. The louder a legacy becomes, the easier it is to mistake repetition for comprehension. Familiar phrases replace difficult questions. Admiration substitutes for examination. Over time, meaning thins. Churchill's life challenges this thinning, because beneath the repetition lies a structure that does not reveal itself quickly. This structure is built from contradiction. He was decisive yet frequently uncertain, defiant yet deeply anxious, visionary in moments, rigid in others, celebrated for leadership, dismissed for politics. These contradictions do not cancel each other out. They coexist, and it is in this coexistence that Churchill remains useful. History often seeks coherence. It prefers stories where character aligns smoothly with outcome. Churchill's life resists that alignment. His character collided with outcomes as often as it produced them. This collision is instructive. It shows that leadership is not about harmony between self and situation, but about friction, about managing the tension between instinct and reality, between belief and consequence. Churchill managed this tension unevenly. At times he overreached. At times he hesitated. At times he imposed certainty where flexibility was required. At other times he accepted compromise reluctantly but effectively. What unites these moments is not correctness but engagement. Churchill never disengaged from consequence. Even when wrong, he stayed present. This presence matters. Many failures become destructive not because of error, but because of withdrawal. Leaders distance themselves from outcomes they cannot control or justify. They delegate responsibility downward or dissolve accountability upward. Churchill did neither. When decisions failed, he absorbed criticism publicly. He defended himself fiercely, but he did not disappear. This willingness to remain exposed preserved continuity. Continuity is undervalued. In crisis, continuity stabilizes systems. It prevents fragmentation. It allows learning to occur within structure rather than chaos. Churchill understood this instinctively. His insistence on continuity of government, of resolve, of communication was not merely symbolic, it was functional. It maintained coherence while conditions deteriorated. This function is often mistaken for theatrics, but it was not performance. It was maintenance. Maintenance lacks drama. It does not feel heroic. It involves repetition, routine, and discipline. It requires sustaining effort without visible progress. Churchill excelled at maintenance during collapse. This excellence is rarely celebrated because it does not fit heroic narrative. Yet without it, dramatic moments fail to convert into durable outcomes. Maintenance carries cost. It drains energy. It produces fatigue. It accumulates stress without release. Churchill's health suffered accordingly. His habits reflected compensation rather than balance. He paid for endurance with longevity of ease. This exchange complicates admiration. It reminds us that sustained leadership extracts personal payment that cannot be refunded. Success does not neutralize cost. It often intensifies it. When history settles, it does not choose sides. It chooses distance. From that distance, lives once lived under pressure become subjects of analysis rather than urgency. Decisions once made in seconds are debated for decades. Certainty dissolves, replaced by interpretation. This is where Winston Churchill now exists, not in the urgency of command, but in the ambiguity of consequence. Churchill was shaped by danger. Remove danger and much of his logic seems excessive. His severity appears disproportionate. His pessimism feels heavy-handed. But danger was not theoretical to him. It was observed. He had lived through moments where delay invited catastrophe, where hesitation hardened threat, where optimism masked preparation failure. These experiences taught him that danger rarely announces itself clearly. It accumulates quietly, dismissed until response becomes expensive. This belief formed the core of his judgment. It explains his intolerance for complacency. It explains his distrust of reassurance. It explains his willingness to appear unpopular. But belief shaped by danger can linger too long. What protects in crisis can constrain in peace. Churchill's difficulty adapting to post-war conditions reflects this tension. He remained alert when others sought relief. He emphasized vigilance when others wanted restoration. He prepared for fracture when others prioritized healing. This mismatch reduced alignment. Churchill did not fail because he misunderstood peace. He failed because peace demanded different instincts. Instincts forged in danger do not dissolve automatically. They persist. And persistence, while valuable, can become liability. Churchill recognized this slowly. Recognition did not bring reinvention, it brought acceptance. He accepted that his instincts, once essential, were now misaligned. He did not attempt to reframe them as universally correct. He allowed relevance to narrow. This allowance preserved honesty. Honesty about limits is rare among those once elevated. Churchill's willingness to accept limits without denying contribution adds credibility to his legacy. It suggests that leadership is not validated by permanence. It is validated by timing. Timing determined Churchill's effectiveness. When timing aligned, his influence was decisive. When timing shifted, his influence waned. This fluctuation should not surprise us. History rewards fit. Churchill fit a moment. That moment passed. This reality does not diminish his contribution. It defines it. Defining contribution accurately matters because it prevents misuse. When figures are misused, their legacies distort present judgment. Churchill is often misused as shorthand for decisiveness and refusal to compromise. But his resolve was not rigidity. It was commitment to outcome, not method. That distinction is crucial. Churchill's life, remembered precisely, resists myth. It anchors his significance in reality rather than symbolism. It allows admiration without imitation and study without worship. Long after Churchill, this balance remains difficult to maintain, but it is necessary. Without it, history becomes decoration. With it, history remains discipline. And Churchill's life, when handled with care, still teaches discipline. There is a moment, long after action ends, when history must decide what to keep. Not everything survives. Not everything should. Time preserves what continues to explain the present and discards what no longer illuminates it. In this process, figures like Winston Churchill are not remembered whole. They are distilled. This distillation is unavoidable. What matters is how carefully it is done. Churchill's life offers more material than most can hold at once. The temptation is to compress, to choose the most dramatic moments and allow them to stand in for the whole crisis. Leadership replaces preparation. Speeches replace struggle. Victory replaces waiting. This compression is efficient. It is also misleading because it removes the connective tissue that gives meaning to action. Churchill's most visible moments make little sense without the years that preceded them. His certainty during war cannot be understood without his doubt during peace. His defiance during collapse cannot be separated from his isolation during mourning. These connections are fragile. Once broken, his life becomes myth rather than study. Study requires patience. It requires lingering on intervals that produced no applause, on decisions that produced no immediate result, on warnings that were ignored. Churchill lived most of his life in these intervals. They shaped him more than his victories ever could. Yet intervals are rarely preserved. They are too quiet, too ambiguous, too resistant to narrative payoff. History prefers moments. Churchill's challenge to history is that his moments only matter because of his intervals. Without the years of preparation, his leadership would have lacked depth. Without the failures, his judgment would have lacked restraint. Without the waiting, his response would have lacked calibration. This layered development resists simplification. It insists that effectiveness is cumulative, not spontaneous. Modern culture often treats leadership as instantaneous. Figures rise quickly, are celebrated rapidly, and dismissed just as fast. Preparation is assumed rather than examined. Experience is conflated with exposure. Churchill's life contradicts this pattern. He did not rise quickly. He was not consistently admired. He was not always aligned with his time. Yet when alignment occurred, it was decisive. This suggests a different model of relevance, one based on readiness rather than momentum. Readiness is invisible until tested. Churchill's readiness was tested late, and it held. This holding is not dramatic, it is structural. Structures matter long after personalities fade. Churchill contributed to structures political, rhetorical, psychological, that persisted beyond his presence. He reinforced the idea that continuity during crisis stabilizes societies, that honesty, even when severe, preserves trust, that leadership must sometimes prioritize endurance over optimism. There is a final responsibility that history quietly assigns, not to the figures who lived it, but to those who inherit it. Once action ends and memory begins, the task shifts. The burden is no longer decision, but interpretation. No longer survival, but understanding. Winston Churchill's life has now lived longer in memory than it ever did in command, and interpretation is more demanding than action. Action occurs under pressure. Interpretation occurs under comfort. Pressure narrows choices. Comfort multiplies them. This difference reshapes judgment. What once felt necessary now appears excessive. What once felt urgent now seems severe. Churchill's leadership is vulnerable to this distortion because he governed in a world where failure meant collapse. Delay was not inconvenience, it was danger. Hesitation was not caution, it was invitation. His decisions were shaped by compression of time, incomplete information, and irreversible risk. Remove that context, and his logic can seem extreme. But context is not decoration, it is substance. Churchill's worldview was formed by observing how quickly systems fracture and how slowly they recover. He saw that continuity, once broken, is difficult to restore. This belief drove his emphasis on firmness and preparation. It also limited him. Instincts forged in danger persist beyond it. What protects in crisis can constrain in peace. Churchill's difficulty adapting after the war reflects this tension. He remained vigilant when others sought relief. He emphasized readiness when others wanted rebuilding. This mismatch reduced alignment. Churchill did not misunderstand peace. He was shaped by survival. Survival teaches different lessons than prosperity. It prioritizes defense over reform. It values order over experimentation. These priorities stabilized society, but they also delayed transformation. Understanding this duality is essential to honest memory. Churchill's life does not ask to be celebrated. It asks to be handled carefully. Care requires holding contradiction without erasing either side. It requires acknowledging effectiveness without ignoring cost. It requires recognizing contribution without converting it into doctrine. Churchill was not a universal leader. He was a situational one. His temperament aligned with a specific crisis. When that crisis passed, alignment faded. He accepted this slowly, reluctantly, but deliberately. He did not insist on permanence. He did not claim entitlement. He stepped back. This step matters. It confirms that leadership is conditional, that authority derives from relevance, not reward, that timing, not ambition, determines impact. Churchill's willingness to relinquish centrality preserved institutional integrity. It allowed transition without fracture. It kept leadership from becoming obstruction. Many fail here. Churchill did not. This does not absolve his limitations, but it contextualizes his end. History often turns figures into symbols and then uses those symbols to justify present decisions. Churchill is frequently invoked this way as shorthand for decisiveness and defiance. But defiance without context is noise. Churchill's resolve was not rigidity, it was commitment to outcome, not method. He compromised when compromise preserved survival. He negotiated when negotiation protected continuity. He adapted within bounds, and when his framework no longer fit, he allowed it to age. This honesty preserves learning. It prevents myth. Myth comforts. History instructs. Churchill's life remains instructive only if it is interpreted with discipline, not as reassurance that leaders will always appear, but as reminder that readiness must be built long before it is required. At some point, history stops asking what a leader did and begins asking why we keep returning to them. Winston Churchill occupies this space, now not as a guide to action but as a mirror. Each generation revisits him not because his circumstances repeat, but because uncertainty does. Pressure returns in new forms. Fear resurfaces under different names, and when it does, societies look backward, searching for figures who once stood when collapse felt imminent. Churchill becomes visible in these moments, not because he offers answers, but because he represents response. This distinction is essential. Churchill's continued relevance is not rooted in his policies or positions. Most of those belong to another era. What endures is the posture he embodied under stress, attentiveness, refusal to minimize danger, and willingness to carry responsibility without guarantee. These traits resonate whenever certainty dissolves, but resonance carries risk. When figures are revisited too often, they can be misused. Their complexity is compressed into attitude. Their context is replaced by analogy. Churchill becomes shorthand for defiance, invoked without regard for conditions. This shorthand distorts. Because Churchill's defiance was not impulsive bravado, it was calculated persistence informed by experience. He did not oppose for identity, he opposed when delay threatened survival. This threshold matters. Without it, defiance becomes performance. Understanding Churchill requires attention to thresholds, those invisible lines where hesitation becomes danger, where compromise becomes erosion, where patience becomes denial. Churchill crossed these thresholds reluctantly. He warned, he waited, he tested evidence. Only when resistance hardened did he insist. This patience is often forgotten. People remember the speeches. They forget the years of dismissal. Yet, endurance during dismissal shaped his authority more than applause ever could. Churchill tolerated being ignored. This tolerance is rare. It requires confidence without validation, conviction without reward, preparation without promise. He developed it through failure. Failure taught him restraint. It also taught him discipline. By the time power arrived, his language was focused. His message was narrow. His tone was controlled. He did not speak to impress. He spoke to stabilize. There is a subtle difference between remembering history and using it. Remembering preserves detail. Using simplifies. Winston Churchill now exists at the intersection of these two impulses. He is remembered in books and archives, but he is also used as reference, used as validation, used as warning. His image is summoned whenever decisiveness feels absent and hesitation feels dangerous. This usage reshapes perception, and perception, once shaped, resists correction. Churchill's defiance is often admired as instinct, as natural courage, as automatic resolve. But this reading is incomplete. His defiance was not spontaneous, it was constructed. It came from years of observation, failure, exclusion, and preparation. It emerged only after alternatives collapsed. It was paired with a willingness to absorb consequence. Defiance without this foundation becomes performance. Churchill understood this difference. He did not oppose for identity. He opposed when cost of delay exceeded cost of action. He waited until evidence accumulated. He tolerated dismissal. He accepted ridicule. Only when danger hardened into certainty did he insist. This patience is rarely remembered. People remember the posture. They forget the process. But the process is the lesson. Churchill's endurance was not heroic stamina. It was organized persistence. He relied on discipline more than inspiration, routine more than impulse, structure more than charisma. He managed emotion through habit. He controlled anxiety through preparation. He limited chaos by imposing order on his own life. This self-management made leadership possible. It allowed endurance to last. Endurance, in his case, was not limitless. It required compensation. It required isolation. It required sacrifice. Churchill paid these costs. They shaped his later limitations. The same discipline that preserved coherence also hardened perspective. The same vigilance that protected stability resisted change. The same skepticism that prevented collapse delayed reform. Understanding this tension is essential. Churchill was prepared for danger. He was less prepared for renewal. This imbalance defines his decline. He recognized it, and he accepted it. There is an instinct, when looking back at history, to search for reassurance, to believe that moments of collapse always produce figures capable of response, that that silence in the face of danger carried its own cost. This belief sustained him when influence was absent. Belief without impact is difficult to maintain. It requires conviction without reward. Churchill maintained it imperfectly, but persistently. This persistence refined judgment, not by eliminating error, but by contextualizing it. He learned where his instincts misfired. He learned when boldness overreached. He learned when urgency obscured nuance. These lessons informed later restraint. Restraint is rarely associated with Churchill, yet it defined his wartime leadership more than force. There is a quiet truth that emerges only after enough time has passed. That history does not reward intention. It records consequence. Winston Churchill intended many things. Some succeeded, others did not. But intention alone did not secure his place in history. Consequence did, and consequence is rarely controlled by those who create it. Churchill understood this. It is why he worried less about being liked than about being effective. Approval was temporary, outcome endured. He chose, repeatedly, to accept unpopularity if it preserved function. This choice carried weight. It isolated him. It narrowed his circle. It deepened his distance from those he governed. Yet, it also preserved clarity. He did not confuse applause with stability. He did not mistake agreement for preparedness. This distinction defined his leadership. Churchill's focus was not harmony. It was continuity. Continuity of state, continuity of morale, continuity of decision-making under pressure. He believed that once continuity breaks, recovery becomes exponentially harder. Systems fragment. Authority dissolves. Panic multiplies. This belief was shaped by observation, not theory. He had watched governments fall. He had watched hesitation invite aggression. He had watched delay harden into disaster. These observations formed the backbone of his judgment. Judgment, in his case, was not visionary, it was defensive. Churchill defended against collapse more than he advanced toward ideal futures. His imagination was oriented toward prevention rather than construction. This orientation explains both his success and his limitation. It made him effective when danger loomed. It made him less effective when rebuilding required optimism, compromise, and redistribution. Understanding this duality prevents misinterpretation. Churchill's greatness did not lie in designing peace. It lay in sustaining survival. Survival is not aspirational. It is foundational. Without it, aspiration fails. Churchill provided foundation. Others built upon it. This sequencing matters. Yet sequencing is often lost in retrospective judgment. People attribute outcomes to the most visible figure, rather than to the long process that followed. Churchill's visibility during crisis makes him a focal point, but stability afterward required different skills, different temperaments, different priorities. He did not possess all of them. He did not claim to. This restraint matters. Churchill never argued that his leadership style was universally applicable. He did not present himself as a model for peace. He understood that leadership must evolve or step aside. This understanding guided his withdrawal. Withdrawal, in his case, was not defeat. It was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the moment had changed, that alignment had shifted, that continuity now required different hands. This acknowledgement preserved institutional integrity. It prevented leadership from becoming obstruction. Many fail here. Churchill did not. This does not absolve his earlier rigidity, but it contextualizes his end. His life demonstrates that relevance is episodic, that contribution does not require permanence, that readiness matters more than visibility. He mattered because he remained prepared through long periods of obscurity. He endured irrelevance without disengaging, and when alignment arrived, he responded, then he stepped aside. This is the shape of consequence. As history stretches further away from lived memory, something subtle begins to happen. The past stops feeling dangerous. Events that once carried existential risk become stories. Decisions once balanced on collapse become case studies. Fear fades first, then urgency follows. And when urgency fades, judgment changes. This distance reshapes how Winston Churchill is understood. Because Churchill was shaped by danger, remove danger, and much of his logic seems excessive. His severity appears disproportionate. His pessimism feels heavy. His warnings sound alarmist. But danger was not theoretical to him. It was lived. Churchill had seen how quickly nations fall when denial replaces preparation. He had watched how optimism delays action. He had witnessed how hesitation invites disaster. These experiences formed his worldview. To him, danger did not announce itself. It accumulated quietly. In the end, history does not ask whether a man was admired. It asks whether he mattered, not in intention, not in reputation, but in consequence. Winston Churchill mattered because he stood at the point where collapse was possible and refused to look away. Not because he foresaw everything, but because he stayed present when others retreated into comfort or denial. This is where his story must finally rest.